The Papal Basilica of St. Paul's outside the walls is one of the 4 papal basilicas of Rome, the second largest after St. Peter's in the Vatican. It stands along the Via Ostiense, in the district of the same name, near the left bank of the Tiber, about 2 kilometers outside the Aurelian walls, leaving the Porta San Paolo. It stands on the site that tradition indicates as the burial place of the Apostle Paul. The saint's tomb is located under the papal altar. For this reason, over the centuries, it has always been a destination for pilgrims. Since 1300, the date of the first holy year, it has been part of the Jubilee itinerary to obtain an indulgence, and the rite of the opening of the Holy Door is celebrated there. Since the 8th century, the care of the liturgy and the votive lamp on the tomb of the Apostle has been entrusted to the Benedictine monks of the adjoining Abbey of St. Paul outside the walls. The entire complex of buildings enjoys the benefit of the extraterritoriality of the Holy See, even though it is located in the territory of the Italian Republic. The Basilica is an institution linked to the Holy See, including the annexed abbey. Over the entire extraterritorial complex, the Holy See enjoys full and exclusive jurisdiction, as well as the prohibition, on the part of the Italian state, to carry out expropriations or impose taxes. The place is included in the list of UNESCO World Heritage Sites since 1980. Here, the first Christians erected a sepulchral chapel, later transformed into a basilica by Constantine and consecrated, according to tradition, by Pope Sylvester I in 324. In 385, reconstruction of the temple began on a larger scale, ending in 395 under Emperor Honorius. Having become one of the most important stops on the pilgrimage to Rome, the present form of the basilica is due to Pasquale Belli, who, in collaboration with other architects, rebuilt it between 1825 and 1854, after the devastating fire of 1823. The facade, decorated in the upper part with 19th-century mosaics, is the work of Luigi Poletti, author also of the bell tower and of the pronaos on the northern side, the latter realized by reusing 12 columns already in the nave of the previous church, and is preceded by a large 4-sided portico, designed at the end of the 19th century by Virginio Vespignani, at the center of which stands the statue of St. Paul by Giuseppe Obasai. The interior is divided into 5 naves by 80 monolithic granite columns. The 6 on the entrance wall, donated by the Viceroy of Egypt to Gregory XVI, are remarkable. The central nave, which is wider, has mosaics on the walls with portraits of popes, which continue also in the side aisles, and frescoes with stories from the life of St. Paul. The central altar, below which is the confessional and the tomb of the Apostle, is surmounted by the famous Gothic ciborium by Arnolfo di Cambio, 1285. To the right of the altar, the large candelabrum for the Easter candle, made of marble by Nicola d'Angelo and Pietro Basiletto in 1170. The apse is dominated by the majestic mosaic, commissioned by Innocent III, 1198-1216, and finished at the time of Honorius III. In the cloister are preserved numerous architectural fragments, coming from the ancient basilica, and archaeological finds from the nearby Ostiense burial ground. The cloister of the basilica, the work of Jacopo and Pietro Basiletto, from whom it takes its name, is one of the wonders of 13th-century Rome. It has marble columns in pairs, of different types and shapes, decorated with mosaics and colored marbles that support the arches on which stands the epistyle, decorated with magnificent mosaics and limited at the top by a white marble frame with heads of lions, oxen, goats and other animals, from the mouths of which flows the rainwater. The Benedictine monks of the Abbey of St. Paul, who for centuries have been the custodians of the tomb of the Apostle Paul, have created the monastic garden in which they cultivate herbs and trees mentioned in the Bible. A splendid oasis that ideally reproduces the biblical Eden, a timeless place in which to meditate and reflect on the Christian and monastic vision of nature, immersed in an eternal spring. A botanical scientific path, but also theological, philosophical and literary. Among the different environments you can admire the Garden of Simples, Hortus Simplicem, in which are cultivated, according to the millennial Benedictine tradition, medicinal plants used in the realization of phytotherapeutic remedies available at the monastic apothecary. In 2007, some excavations in the garden led to the identification of ancient structures, including the base of a small bell tower, the oldest example of this type of construction preserved in Rome, the buildings related to the houses of the poor dating back to the late 5th century, and the remains of a colonnaded portico. The interior of St. Paul's Basilica is extraordinary, with its huge alabaster columns and precious golden mosaics. Unfortunately, due to the fire of 1823, few medieval parts of the basilica are still intact, although you can still contemplate some mosaics of the 13th century, a large candelabra of the 12th century and the marble canopy of 1285, under which is buried St. Paul. In the upper parts of the walls, you can see the portraits of the various popes who have alternated throughout history. Probably the most interesting part of the church is the Grandiose Atrium with 150 columns, from which you can contemplate the outside of the church covered with a huge golden mosaic, made between 1854 and 1874, which reflects the rays of the sun. The center of the large garden courtyard is dominated by a colossal statue of St. Paul. One of the greatest treasures to be found in the church is the cloister built between 1208 and 1235, which survived the Great Fire and is currently in perfect condition. The interior of St. Paul's Basilica is extraordinary, with its huge alabaster columns and precious golden mosaics. Unfortunately, due to the fire of 1823, few medieval parts of the basilica are still intact, although you can still contemplate some mosaics of the 13th century, a large candelabra of the 12th century and the marble canopy of 1285, under which is buried St. Paul. In the upper parts of the walls, you can see the portraits of the various popes who have alternated throughout history. Probably the most interesting part of the church is the Grandiose Atrium with 150 columns, from which you can contemplate the outside of the church covered with a huge golden mosaic, made between 1854 and 1874, which reflects the rays of the sun. The center of the large garden courtyard is dominated by a colossal statue of St. Paul. One of the greatest treasures to be found in the church is the cloister built between 1208 and 1235, which survived the Great Fire and is currently in perfect condition.